Okay, so let's start our seminar. We are very lucky today to have Альберто Алесина with us, coming straight from the university, I guess. And he will tell us about theft of rational bias and capital sensitivity in the US, but I guess now it becomes an issue that can be of very serious concern even in Russia. There's a lot of talks about sentencing depending on the nationality in Russia as well. So that is a very timely presentation for given the circumstances. So let's welcome Alberto here.
Thank you. Thank you. So this is a paper which joined with Diana Ferrara from Bocconi. We have been working on this paper for quite a few years because the data collection was extraordinarily painful, as you will see in a second. The motivation of this paper is simple. If you read this statement from Amnesty International, which is one of the leading advocates against the death penalty, African Americans are disproportionately represented among people condemned to death in the US. While they only make up 12% of the national population, they account for more than 40% of the country's current death row inmates, and 1 in 3 of those executed since 1997. This statement, although true, can hardly be taken as evidence of a racial bias in the death penalty because, for whatever reason that we are not investigating here, minorities commit much more violent crimes than the white majority. We seem to be stuck.
Maybe you are
too far. Good point. Good point. This paper proposes a test of racial bias that most importantly allows for different crime rates across races, and also does not imply information of all the variables that are relevant on a case, and instead it is outcome-based, namely it's a test on discrimination based on error that made by certain courts that are corrected by higher courts in appeal. And the reason why it's important that the second point is important is that it's basically impossible to come up with all the possible characteristics of a crime that would make two crimes absolutely identical, and then you just see that if the same identical crime is committed by a minority, the sentence is different than if it is committed for a white. It's virtually impossible to have two cases which are absolutely identical. The evidence is identical, and the characteristics of the crime are identical. So, in many ways, it is a dead avenue to try to do test discrimination in that way, but as we will see in a second, there are alternative ways based on error rates that don't require all this information. So this paper proposes a test of racial bias that allows for different crime rates across race, that don't require all the information that you would need not to have error bias test. And this is the last point. Our test rely on the difference between sentences in the first degree, the first capital sentence, and to see whether these capital sentences are reversed or not by superior courts. So most of the district literature try to investigate which homicide gets to the capital sentence stage. Our test is between the first capital sentences and the superior court review. And so the basic idea of our underlying test is that the first court observed some noisy signal, let's call it the evidence, about the guilt or innocence of the criminal, and there will be a certain fraction P of errors in the first sentence stage, where the error can be either because the person is innocent or because the crime that is committed should not be sentenced to death but to a lower sentence. And if the court is unbiased, this error should be the same across different races or across different races of the defendant and across a different race of the victim. So there should be no difference in these error terms. If there were a bias, there would be some statistically significant observable difference in this pattern of error. And in particular, to anticipate what we will find is that minorities or black who kill white should be treated the same way as a white who kill a white. And instead, the key finding of the paper is that this is not true. There is a higher likelihood of judicial error in cases involving a minority defendant who killed a white victim. In the case of the first stage of appeal, the difference is 0.40 versus 0.36, which seems small but is statistically significant, and we are talking about thousands of cases, so these are large numbers, and 0.37 versus 0.27 in the last stage of appeal, and these results are quite robust to many potentially confounding factors. And as we will see in a second, this is the average of north and south, a southern state. If you look at this only a southern state, where most of the bias probably is, those differences, you will see they are actually significantly larger. So this paper is related to two literature. One is a vast legal literature on whether there is a racial bias in capital sentencing. And this literature has the problem that I was mentioning a moment ago, that is trying to look at cases that are identical and see in this case A has been a minority defendant has been found guilty, in case B it has not, and two cases are very similar, therefore there has to be some discrimination. And most of this literature is based on a handful of cases, one state or certain periods, couple of years of data. So it's not very convincing. The other literature, which are probably more closely related to, is the recent economic literature on racial profiling in stopping cars. In particular, there's a really nice paper by Knowles, Persico, and Todd, and two other more recent papers that improve upon that first paper. And these are papers that, like our tests, are outcome-based. So they are based on the probability, on certain properties of the probability of catching, of stopping. These are papers about the police stopping cars to find drugs. And those tests are based on some pattern that the probability of success of finding drugs should be in a certain relationship with the race of the driver of the car. Okay. But the difference is that there is not an issue of evidence or trial or any of that sort, because either you find the drug or you don't, and there is no issue of trial. So what I'm going to do in this talk, and of course, by the way, I welcome comments and criticism and suggestion at any point. Very brief background of some institutional issue of the death penalty in the US, the model, some discussion on the data collection, which is what took us a couple of years, and the empirical results. Okay? Yeah.
Just want to clarify the following. When you say about on racial bias, do you mean the racial bias of the system? Judicial system, legislation?
Well, that's a good question. No. That's a good question. This is a test of racial bias of the first court. So this is a test. If somebody commits an homicide, incidentally, I say homicide not by chance, because the capital sentence can be only given for if you kill somebody. So you kill somebody, you're or you may or may not have killed somebody, there is a capital sentence, and you're sentenced to death. And then this sentence is affirmed or reversed. Under some assumption about this stage, which we'll discuss in a second, we can evaluate whether there was a bias or not. So the test is a bias of these courts. Now, there may be other bias in the system, and we will discuss a little bit that later, but this particular test is about whether there is a bias in the first degree courts. There could be a bias in other parts of the system, and we will talk about some of it later, but the test is about that.
Without controlling on the risk of judges.
No, we don't have the data on the race of the judges. The period that we are looking at is 1975 to 1995, 1998 actually. Partly because it takes about 10 years for this process also to be completed. So in order to have complete cases, we had to stop several years back. At the time, there were very few black judges, so more judges would be white. But we do control for some. We will look at some characteristic of the whether the judges are elected or not. So, what's the point? I need to. So, background. Since in the mid-70s, the death penalty was reinstituted as constitutional in the U.S. All the capital sentences are automatically appealed in state court, and that's called direct appeal. So there is no selection here. All the capital sentences are appealed in that's called this direct appeal at the state level. In some state you have a second stage of review, which we don't really consider because it doesn't apply to all states. And then the final stage is called the habeas corpus, and these are federal courts. There are 5 federal courts in the U.S. that deal with the final stage of capital sentences. In each stage, the court, say the direct appeal or the habeas corpus, can reject the previous conviction, either because the guy is innocent or because it was not supposed to be sentenced to the death but to some other lesser penalty, or there were mistakes in the procedure and so on. And a lot of sentences are overturned, as you can see. At the first stage, 68% of convictions are overturned. So it's a lot of them are indeed overturned. The good thing about the empirical evidence is that there is no self-selection of which cases are receive an appeal or not. They all are appealed, so there is no selection there. So the model is as follows. The race of the defendant is called little r, white or minority. The race of the victim is big R, white or minority. The court observed a unidimensional segment of guilt, let's call it the evidence, where X is the evidence, and is distributed according to FGR if the defendant is guilty, and FNR if not guilty. Notice that this evidence, the distribution of the evidence, can depend on the race of the defendant. So we allow for that difference. This assumption implies the second assumption that Fg over Fn is increasing in X. That simply means that the higher is X, the more likely it is that the guy is guilty rather than innocent. That means that the evidence is increasing with this indicator x. This is a critical assumption which we'll discuss over and over again. Big F, namely the distribution of guilt or innocence, cannot depend on the pair of the victim and of the defendant. Can depend on one of the two. In particular, it can depend, the way we develop the model, it depends on the race of the defendant, but it cannot depend on the two, on the pair. Otherwise, we won't be able to have a test. And they will become clearer as we move along. So the court observed the evidence, and it chooses a threshold in a way which we will derive in a second. Let's call the threshold X star RR, such that the defendant is sentenced to death if X is greater than X star. So the probability of being sentenced to death is the probability that X is greater than X star. And the sentence can be reversed in appeal. The third assumption, which is also critical, is that the appeal court, and in the model we only consider one appeal court. In the empirical evidence we consider the two, direct appeal and habeas corpus. In the model we only have one. The appeal court is unbiased. It finds error if there is an error. So the appeal court is always right. Doesn't make mistakes. Now, this is a little bit of discussion of this assumption. Immediately we will return to that later on. If the superior court makes errors uncorrelated with race, it does not matter. It simply adds noise to the... If the superior courts are also biased against, they have the same bias of the first court, say they're biased against the minorities, or in particular minorities who kill white victims. So if the bias goes in the same direction, we underestimate the amount of bias because not all the mistakes are corrected. So even that the error rate will be a test of bias, this leads us to underestimate the bias. The problem could be if the superior courts do a reverse discrimination. That is, since they know that the primary, the first court have been biased against minority, then they reverse discriminate in favor of minorities, the superior court. In particular, they reverse discrimination against minorities who killed white. Now, in that case, our test would be biased, would not be an unbiased test of racial bias, but we will provide empirical evidence that makes this case quite, makes this hypothesis or the breakdown of this hypothesis quite unlikely, and I will return to that in a second. So what is the problem of the potential critical? Could be the benefit of committing the crime and getting away with it. It could be the benefit of a bank robbery where you kill a policeman and you run away with the money, or it could be the benefit of killing somebody you really don't like. Fiji are the cost of being sentenced to death having committed the crime. CN are the cost of being sentenced to death not having committed the crime. Remember that in this model, nobody is executed if it is innocent. So CN has to be interpreted as the cost of staying in death row for several years, even though you are innocent, which are certainly not trivial costs. And the above, all of the above are public information. What is not public information is the individual cost of committing a crime. The individual cost of committing a crime are private information and are distributed according to a certain distribution which can depend on the race of the defendant. So that distribution F depends on little r. And that allows the fact that different race can commit different level of crimes in equilibrium. So we allow for the fact that black and white commit different level of crimes for whatever reason that we don't investigate in detail. So an individual of race R commits a crime against race big R if The first term is the probability of committing the crime and being caught, because X is greater than X. Remember, X star R is the threshold of the jury that the criminal text is given. So 1 minus F of X star is the probability of being caught. And so you got caught, you pay CG, and you pay the moral cost of having committed the crime, which is V. The second term is the committing the crime and getting away with it, because you get B, but you have to pay the moral cost. That has to be greater, and the right-hand side is the cost of not committing the crime, and you have a small chance that you don't commit the crime, you get caught anyway. So that solution gives you can be summarized in saying that as long as V, my moral cost of committing a crime, is less than V star, and of course V star will depend on what the jury does. So as long as V is less than V star, I will commit the crime. So the probability that a crime is committed is equal to that expression, the probability that V is less than V star RR, and we can call that pi X of RR, which capture, incidentally, is equal to the probability of guilty individual of race R given the threshold chosen by the court. What does the court do? The court, in our model, minimizes a weighted average of type 1 error, which is condemning the innocent, and type 2 error, acquitting the guilty. So if these are the two distributions of guilt and innocence, the red thing is the red area is the type 1 error, and the yellow area is the type 2 error, and the court minimizes that area with some weight given to the two types of error. Yeah. Yes, they take into account that there is going to be an appeal, but remember that if you throw out somebody who is guilty, see, if the first court throws out somebody that says you are innocent, then you're out of the system. You cannot be retried again. So, incidentally, this is the law. You cannot be tried twice.
Prosecution cannot read appeal.
No. The prosecution cannot, at least the way we model things, they can't. So if you're out of the system, if you are acquitted, you're acquitted, and that's it.
You cannot bring the same deal.
You cannot be tried again for the same crime if you're.
So they should care much more about type 2 error rather than about type 1 error just because of that.
Yes, I mean it. Well, for our test, for our test, the level of the level of how much they care about one or the other is irrelevant. I mean, the only thing that matters is comparing, as you will see, the weight that they give as a function of the races. The absolute level doesn't really matter. First answer. Second answer, in the real world, now if we are assuming that the superior court are perfect. In the real world, there could be mistake, honest mistake, mistake that happened, and therefore then you have to worry about that too. And finally, to to keep somebody in jail for 10 years because they're not sure whether he's innocent or not, and let other court decide, it is a bit costly, you know. Spending 10 years in jail is not something you want to. So for all this reason, condemning an innocent is not that a nice thing to do. So in fact, those weights are called alpha RR. So this is the weight. Those weights can be different according to the pair of defendant and the victim. And the first one is type 1 error, which is the probability of condemning an innocent. And the second one is the expression of the type 2 error, which is the probability of acquitting a guilty. And those weights, alpha RR, that are between 0 and 1, will be the critical component of our test. So going back to your question, it doesn't really matter whether all the alpha RR are high or low. What matters is the comparison between the different type of alpha R and alpha R. In fact, we define completely racially unbiased a court if all the alpha RR are equal to alpha independent of the races. So if the court treats everybody identically, those weights should be the same. Okay. Now, and this is the key. The first order condition of the court is given by this ratio of probability of guilt, the little f, and the propensity of people to commit crime. But the important thing is that the left-hand side depends on the race of the victim, because the probability of guilt or innocence depends on the race of the victim, because we allowed the distribution of evidence to depend on that. This pi depends on the race of the victim because we allow the cost, the moral cost of committing a crime to be different for the race of the race of the defendant. This depends on the race of the defendant because we allowed the cost of committing a crime to be different. So these depend on the race of the defendant, these depend on the race of the defendant. The only place where the race of the victim enters is in those share over there. Okay, the ratio of weights over there, and that will be the key intuition for why we can have a test based on comparing pairs, and that will become clear in a second. But it's important to remember that this is the key. If the race of the victim also affected, for example, this evidence here, that would be impossible to get a test. We need something that changes the error rate, which I'll derive in a second, as a function only of the weight. Because otherwise the error rate, which I'm going to calculate in a second, would depend on all the functional forms and nothing would depend only on the shares. So another derivation of a test. So the capital sentencing rate is given by that gamma, which is equal to the proportion of people who are guilty and the proportion of people that are convicted when they are guilty, plus the proportion of people that are innocent, but they are convicted also when they are innocent. Okay, this is the total capital sentencing rate. The error rate. So from this expression you can derive the error rate, and that's the expression for the error rate. Again, notice that this error rate will depend on the race of the victim if and only if the weight depends on the race of the victim. So, what are our tests of racial bias then? First question is, are defendants treated in the same way regardless of the race of the victim they killed? That is, for given defendant R, is it the case that alpha Rm is equal to alpha Rw, and therefore the error rate for a minority is the same as a minority killing a white, and so on? So that's a test of bias on the victim race that says, are the defendant treated equally, holding constant the race of the victim? It turns out to be not this test. It turns out not to. I mean, this turns out to be not to be biased. There is not going to be no bias according to this test. But the second test, where we will find the bias, is the following: is there a bias on the victim race? If there is a bias on the victim's race, does this bias go in the same direction for defendants of different races? In other words, are white and non-white treated similarly when it comes to whom they have killed? More formally, the test is the following: if the error rate for a minority killing a white is greater than a minority killing a minority, then it has to be the case that the error rate of a white killing a white has to be greater than the white killing a minority. Okay? So that was referred to a rank order test that implies that if you think that killing a minority is less of a deserving, a crime not deserving so much punishment, then it has to be the case that regardless of who is the defendant, this error curve goes in this direction. If it doesn't, it means that there is a bias in the sense that you're punishing the most a minority killing a white, and not as much a white killing a white versus relative to the white killing a minority. Okay, and that's what we are going to find in the empirical evidence, namely that the bias comes into place because the error rate of minority killing white is greater than the error rate of minority killing minority, but this does not hold. So that the test is implied that there is bias. So in terms of statistics, it turns out that the rank order test that we adapt from Anwar and Fang, it shows that this thing there, Z, that captures the difference between observed error rates, is distributed at a normal 0,1, and so therefore we can calculate the probability that these two particular errors, observed error rates, are statistically different or not. And forget that. So let me before I go to data, let me discuss a couple of assumptions. Again, the critical assumption is that the collection of evidence can be a function of the race of the defendant, but not on the race of the victim. If the evidence were dependent on both, it would be the bias would not be the test for the bias would not be correct. There are many things that could go wrong, although in different ways. Perhaps the police may try to work particularly hard to collect good evidence when the victim is white, and therefore it would reduce the number of errors made in this case. On the other hand, the police could make should fabricate evidence when the victim is white and the defendant is black, and that would make more error like to be caught. So it's a little bit unclear where the actual bias would go, but this certainly is an assumption that we cannot get rid of. This is what I said before, but it's worth repeating. The assumption that the superior court never make mistake is an extreme assumption. As long as it is unbiased but makes uncorrelated mistake, this is fine. The only problem is when there is potentially reverse discrimination, namely the superior court compensating for the bias of the first court, the entry court, but we will discuss that empirically and we will rule it out empirically. So let me turn to the data. The data are was a nightmare to put together because most of these studies, most of these legislative studies, they don't have a sense of the macroeconomy like we as economists, at least some economists tend to have. So they do one state, 1 year. There were very few data sets that covered the universe. So we spent quite a bit of time doing that. In particular, we spent quite a bit of time to find the race of the victim. Even though it is public information, nobody ever bothered to collect it in any centralized system, so we had really to go back case by case to try to figure out how the victim was. I won't bore you with the detail, but it took a lot of time and a lot of array work and a lot of money. In any case, the direct appeal data set, there are 4,000, roughly 400,000 direct appeal case for the period 73-95, which is the one we have. The habeas corpus, so the one that reached the highest last stage, is 557, and we have information. We had information on judicial error, but they had no information on race, so we had to construct the race data, and we did an incredible amount of things, including some really funny phone calls where we would call some police officer in Mississippi, some retired police officer, excuse me, do you remember in 1986 that death penalty case? Do you remember when the victim were white or black? And actually, I don't remember. So it really went down to the absolute. Anyway, so we now have all the information we need for essentially all the habeas corpus case. We only have 4% of the data missing, that is 20 cases. And 407 direct appeal cases. We miss 407, so we miss about 13%. We checked whether there are bias in observables between the missing data and the one we have, and there are not that many obvious biases, so I will skip that. So this is some of the key results. This is from the direct appeal. On the column side, you see the defendant's race. On the victim race is on the horizontal direction. So the key thing to read is that there are more error that are then corrected when there's a non-white defendant killing a white victim. There's 40% of error, versus 36% when a non-white kills a non-white, and there is no difference between when a white kill a white or a white kill a non-white. So there seems to be that test of discrimination that goes in the direction of saying there are really a difference in the non-white killing white and the non-white killing non-white, and many more error are corrected, 0.40, when there is a non-white killing a white. This is the habeas corpus, the same table for the habeas corpus. Here the difference is very large, 10 percentage point, again, from non-white killing white. There is many more error than non-white killing non-white, and there is no significant difference in the other direction. This for the habeas corpus. By region,
Alberto,
yeah.
in the previous slide, if you compare the vertical lines, right, the rows, if you compare white killing non-white and non-white killing non-white, this 47 and 28, would that be significant too? You're not
no, you cannot compare that because here you're making a comparison with. In fact, I had slides about that. Let me go back to that. You cannot. The reason why you cannot do that is because what you're doing there is this. You would be doing a test on the defendant's race. And the test of the defendant's race you cannot do because when the race of the defendant, when you change the race of the defendant, you change, amongst other things, you change those curves, the F of guilt and F of innocence. So our test is based on whether the threshold that the court chooses moves in different direction as a function of the parameter alpha. So in particular, if they are particularly concerned about acquitting a guilty, then it moves in this direction. So we are interested in seeing whether this X star threshold moves as a function of the alphas. But when you change the race of the defendant, those curves also change because they are different for white and black. So if this threshold is different, it would be simply because the curves have changed, but it would not be a test of bias. So you cannot compare, at least under the assumption that black have a different propensity to commit crimes, and the evidence that you collect on black and white is different. You cannot make that test.
But that's based on your assumptions, essentially. These curves are assumed.
Well, it's not that they are assumed. They are assumed that they are different.
Right.
Yeah, the assumption is that they are different. If they were the same, you still could not make that. I think you could still not make that comparison you want to do because the propensity of committing crime is different between races. Maybe you couldn't. Maybe you could make that conclusion. No, take it back. What makes your conclusion within the model incorrect is that those curves are different. And the idea why these curves are different is that, well, first of all, could have a lot to do with police work and police work collecting harder evidence when there is a black defendant and so on and so forth. So that's it. The theoretical answer is that you cannot make that conclusion because the curves are different. The empirical answer is that I will show you a lot of tables, and that big difference that you see there is not robust. I mean, in some cases it's there, some cases it's not there.
I guess my question is indeed, if you assume that propensity to commit crime is the same, is there a bias in against white, non-white dependents killing non-whites? Right? But what you're saying is you assume that dependents, the whites and non-whites may have different propensities to commit crime.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't accept that, and you start from a model where they have the same propensity to commit crime, then you would get a much simpler test that the proportion of black on the death row should be the same as the proportion of the population, or you would get a very, very simple. In fact, you would get some interesting result. I mean, suppose that black and white had the same propensity to commit crime. But suppose that there was a racial bias against black. Then the black would internalize that and commit fewer crimes because they know they will be discriminated against. So in equilibrium, you would have that black commit less crime than white, which of course is counterfactual. If you don't go in the direction of saying black and white have different propensity to commit crime, and the evidence collected may be different, you soon get into results which are empirically counterfactual. Yes?
In some states, as I understand it, you can only go for the death penalty under special circumstances. I think in California, like if you kill a policeman, you can go for the death penalty, but if you kill a normal person, you might not go for the death penalty. So I'm wondering if that's the case, and you have more whites than blacks who are policemen, who are more likely to then be murdered. So then, the race of the victim might affect the decision of the courts to go for the death penalty in the first place.
Then that is a very good question. In fact, in a couple of slides, I will show you a set of results, including the case of police killing a police or not, and to see whether this bias comes into place if a certain type of crime or not other. The answer will be no, but but just to slightly rephrase your question, again, here this test is based on the fact that we are not observing anything on the crime, we're just looking at error rate. But then we need to worry about the kind of thing that you just mentioned, namely perhaps there are characteristics of the crimes that might be correlated with those errors, even though they have nothing to do with the bias. And I think the police one is one of the first that came to mind, and we have many others to show you in a second. But before doing that, this is by region. This is the difference between North and South, again, the same result, but bigger difference, 43 to 38, for the direct appeal.
Yeah, twice.
For South, compared with other, because the number of people living in South is so much smaller.
Yeah, but they
There
love
is no
the
death
death penalty.
penalty.
We don't have the death penalty in many northern states. Are you looking only at states that actually execute people, or states that have the death penalty but never execute anybody? Like in Pennsylvania, we haven't had an execution in like 50 years.
These are the number of not executed. These are the number of sentences. So if Pennsylvania there are no sentences, Pennsylvania will be recorded as 0. In fact, I mean, to go for a second. In fact, it is well known that the death penalty is much more popular in certain states than in others, particularly in the South. And if you look at the habeas corpus case, the error difference is huge, from 39 to 23 in the case of non-white killing white versus killing non-white, and yes, the number of habeas corpus cases, namely sentences that reach the final stage in the North, are very few, because they're all in the South. So when you say the racial bias is only in the South, but the death penalty is almost only in the South, so that's what really matters.
And this question about who is responsible for this racial bias. Because the judges are white, so but still the jury is doing decision whether the defendant is guilty or not. And so the jury is to some extent individuals as a selection process.
Yeah, but two comments on this. First, it is actually not, I mean, the jury in some states, and that also changes over time, in some states the jury decide guilt or non-guilt, but whether it is a death penalty or not is decided by the judge. Whether it is a death penalty or, say, life in prison is the judge that decides. No. There are very small fraction of murder cases that are set. I mean, there are many more murders than there are death sentences. In fact, there are very few. There are very few murders that reach the stage of capital sentencing. And capital sentencing, as somebody pointed out, you get a capital sentence for murder if you have some aggravating circumstances. But those aggravating circumstances are not, white and black. I mean, killing a policeman is pretty clear, but then there are other things like the crime has to be particularly violent. Who decides how much violence is too much? So in some states the jury, in some states is the judge. It would be nice to have data on the racial composition of the jury, and the racial composition of the jury. The judges are almost 99% white, particularly in the South. And we don't have that. We don't have the race of the jury. When you were saying something about strategic, you're right. The choice of the jury is strategic, but there are two players involved: the defense and the prosecution. So it's not clear who's going to win. Oh yeah, if we had the data, yes. If we had the data, yes. But we don't.
So it's both. It's a logic, so it depends on the traditional people in the city, where there's many.
Well, I'm not sure the proportion. I'm not sure that the proportion of people. I think in the South there are more blacks than there are a lot of. There are proportion of blacks in the South is higher in the North, but certainly the discrimination is certainly higher in the South than in the North. I'm not sure that the proportion of minorities is a good proxy for the amount of discrimination.
You registered for election, election to be
No, really, no. I can be. I mean, even before being an American citizen, can be clearly not registered as a voter, can be called for jury duty. Now, more generally, yes. If we had the data on the race of the jury and the race of the judge, would be very useful, but we don't. So this is what the question I was getting a moment ago. Can differential error rates be driven by certain things which are correlated with the error but don't really are a test of bias? In other words, to put it differently, is it the case that more murder involving a minority killing a white are a different type of crime that deserve more harsh punishment simply because of the nature of the crime, but not because of the combination of races? For example, because there are more police victims, another important point, which is perhaps minorities, particularly minorities killing white, are at worse legal representation. Now, having a worse legal representation could still be thought as being discrimination, but it would be a discrimination different than what we are testing, and we'll see in a moment that there is a little bit of both. So these are crime characteristics. No female victim, the difference is still there. No police victim, the difference is there, marginally significant. Single victim versus multiple victim, This is for the habeas corpus. No female victim, no police victim. The difference is still there. Single victim, difference is there. This is the high status victim is a little funny. This data collected by this couple of data sets from lawyers identify some high status victim in some ways, which is slightly arbitrary. But this is more interesting. Defendant not connected to community where the crime occurred. This is important because there is a sense in which Americans see as they feel more scared by homicide committed randomly, not by your wife or husband, but you walk in the street and you're killed, then those homicides get particularly worry people. So if a minority kill a white, it's more likely to be the case of a crime where you don't know the person, one of the random crime, and therefore maybe that's what's capturing there. So, but we break the sample into two, and the difference is still there. So it's not an issue being connected to the victim race. For the habeas corpus, we have some additional crime characteristic: robbery with the murder, and that could go on and on, but we really did not find anything particularly important. So this is something about trial characteristics. We only have for the habeas corpus data set. These identify cases in which the appeal was granted because of ineffective assistance of counsel. So one of the reasons why if you are sentenced to death, you can appeal is that your lawyer was stupid or ineffective. And here we look at the cases in which this was not the case. Namely, all the cases in which appeal occurred for whatever reason, but not because you get ineffective assistance from your legal counsel. And the discrimination that we find, or the racial bias that we find, is still there, even for those cases in which, at least on paper, legal assistance was not an issue. Even though we do find, looking at the data, there are many more cases of minority that are cases that are appealed because of ineffective legal assistance. So minorities get ineffective legal assistance, but even leaving that aside, and you concentrate on the cases where ineffective assistance was not the issue, we still find that racial bias. Okay, now last thing I want to do is to talk a little bit about this issue of reverse discrimination. Could it be that superior courts do some sort of reverse discrimination? Namely, when they see a minority, they are nice to the minority because they know that the first court have been nasty to the minorities. Now, a couple of things. First of all, here we discovered the bias of minorities killing white. So the reverse discrimination that the superior court should do should not be in favor of any minorities, but only of the minorities who killed white. So that's a very, I don't know what to call it, but fairly specific issue of reverse discrimination or compensation. So to simply say that superior court will be nicer to minorities, that would not correct the bias. In order to correct the bias, the superior court has to be nice to minorities killing white. Having said that, our understanding of the legal literature that we read is that, particularly at this high level, these are federal courts, I think that in the objective function of the judges is the goal to be right and never being caught that it made a mistake. So I think they tried as much as they can to be right. The worst thing that could happen to them is that they have been proven wrong. So I think the assumption that they try to be as right as possible and unbiased is, I think, is fairly realistic. But let's look at some evidence. Now, the interesting and somewhat perhaps non-obvious implication of our test is that if there were reverse discrimination, those who do the reverse discrimination should be the most left-leaning or liberal in the American test, in the American connotation, judges, namely those who are more worried about racial bias, and therefore they should go out of their way to correct the mistake. So we should find that the more liberal judges are those who overcorrect the mistakes, and therefore we should find that this difference in rate of comes from the fact that liberal judges overturn a lot more sentences involving minorities killing white. That turns out to be not to be the case. We found a paper where these three lawyers construct a measure of ideology for each state Supreme Court justice serving in that period, and we test whether, according to the measure of these people, if only the left-wing judges who reverse, and it turned out not to be the case. For example, if you look at whether the Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court is conservative for these direct appeal cases, the difference is still there and is statistically at least borderline significant, and the same for the median ideology of the Superior Court. So this shows that it is that the conservative judges, as much as the liberal judges, do have this pattern of error correction. So that goes against the idea that the statistical pattern that we found earlier comes because liberal judges wanted to overturn the first court. So since we found them also for conservative, that goes in the direction of saying that they're not doing reverse discrimination. For the habeas corpus, we don't have, these are federal courts, we don't have the same measure of ideology. We do something much rough, which is something close to party affiliation. This is majority of the final federal panel for the habeas corpus is Republican. The number are there, not statistically significant, but the number 0.284 and 0.216 goes in the right direction. All judges are appointed under Republican president. Again, the bias is there. The sentence occurred under a Republican administration that maybe captured the more conservative attitude of everybody. The bias is still there. This is what I was referring to about a moment ago. This is to go a little bit into who decides about the death penalty. There are two types of situations. One when the sentence is determined by the jury, and the other one when the sentence is determined by the judge, or in some case a mixed system between judge and the jury. These are the state for which the judge and basically the judge decide the sentence. All the other states in which the death penalty is legal are decided only by the judge. Look, there is a minority of majority of cases fall in state where the judge that's making the decision doesn't seem to be a huge difference between the two. Perhaps there is more bias when the juries are involved, but the pattern goes, at least the pattern goes in the same direction. Finally, we looked at another difference. There are situations in which judges are elected, for the state judges are elected, and some in which they are not. We looked at whether, then for a mixed system, we looked at it is mostly the elected judges that have the bias, and it turns out that indeed it is the elected judges that have the racial bias that we have found earlier. The non-elected judges seem to have no bias. I think we are investigating this result a little more, namely whether it is robust and whether we are interacting where the judge is elected with the preference of the district as a function of whether they're more Republican or more Democrat. But this suggests that elected judges are perhaps more politically attuned to the sentiment of the people, and if there is some racial bias within the population, they represent it in their sentences.
But like Texas, you have on the top, so it's like the judges. But in the previous one, Texas was a jury state, not a judge state. So why does the judge really matter?
That's true.
You know, I mean, if you compare these two, so you know.
Oops.
Yeah. It would seem like you'd look at, the differences. You'd take the states that had the judge or the hybrid, so those Arizona through Florida, and then do the second table.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that's right.
But also, these judges might be more sensitive to the media surrounding the appeal, and people like Amnesty International flooding the media maybe in cases where there's a non-white murder trial.
Yeah, there are certainly cases which are much more racially charged than other cases, and in fact, part of the reason why it was very easy to get up to say 2/3 of the data was that when the race of the victim was when the crime was very racially charged, the race of the victim was very easy to find. But when it was not, it was much more difficult. So indeed, there are cases which are more charged than others, and on those cases, there may be more pressure on the judges on either side of the political spectrum. And I think that the next step, if we can, would be precisely to go in that direction, to interact whether the judges are elected or not with something which may affect their objective function in terms of re-election. But we are not quite there yet. But there is also some, by the way, there are some other papers by Besley and forget who else, who also found that elected judges tend to be tougher on crime or something along those lines. But this is not the first paper that pointed some difference between elected and non-elected judges. Say it again?
Could be that it is not the first court judges' bias which might have been about superior court bias?
Do we reverse in the old story?
No. So if it's if the bias is at upper level, then it would be different in those two types of states. Because of some maybe alignment of the interest of superior interest decision making involved. So those judges which are not elected, they can take into
well, in the model, the assumption is that superior courts are unbiased. Here, this evidence, particularly this one on the ideology of the superior judges, is trying to argue that it is unlikely to be the case that the superior courts are biased in a way which is the opposite of the entry of the first court, and so which would make the test.
I think in reality, all this superior court and some courts that understand how biased are the low-level judges in courts, and they take into account those biases.
Well, no, they should. Yeah, but the question is, suppose that they take into account, but they take into account and do what?
And given the same type of crime and the same circumstances, they are more often reward decisions where white, non-white, not white.
No,
The first level judges, they are more biased.
I understand. I mean, the answer I have to that question are two. One is that I have two answers. One is that my understanding is that the superior court, the federal court, they gather more information, they examine the file, and they try to go deeper, and their objective is not to make errors. And if that's the case, then the tests are fine, even if they make errors which are uncorrelated with the race. Now, it would be a problem if the superior court, they said, okay, I know that there could be a bias from the first court, so let's be extra, just when in doubt, let's be extra nice with minority killing whites. The answer to the question is that, which is an empirical answer, not a logical answer. The empirical answer is that that behavior that we just described is more likely to occur with judges who are on the left side of the political spectrum. Yeah, they're not. What?
Not necessarily.
Well, I think in the U.S., the correlation between attention to racial bias, affirmative action, and so on and so forth is highly correlated with left or right. Redistribution of income and racial issues are the two things which are most defining of left and right. So. Yes, it is. Again, it's not a mathematical proof. But let's put it this way: if we found that the conservative judges do no correction, and all the correction came from liberal judges, I would be even more worried. Put it that way. Quite frankly, I personally. My feeling is that the real answer is that those are very, very high-level judges. You know, there are a handful in the United States. They want to go down in history for being right, not for being nice, I think. So I think that's my view.
The question is, what would happen if you look at different error rates? You said in the beginning that there are errors in which convicted people turn out to be innocent, and there are errors in which convicted to capital punishment go by higher courts sentenced to life sentence. So
which is a majority of the case.
Yeah, I think that what you show here, it's a combination, right? but what would this table be different if you consider second error rate for innocence and error rate for just milder punishment? Because error rate for innocent is really mistakes, but error rates for capital punishment turned to lifetime sentence is just, it might, as you said, whether this crime is violent or not, it's very subjective.
Yeah, that's a very interesting suggestion. I haven't thought about it. No, we have not done it, so I don't know what the result is. Although I think that the cases in which the guy was found, and I say the guy not on purpose, because there are actually no women sentenced to death. There have been no women sentenced to death in all this entire sample, which is another interesting fact. I mean, why women don't get sentenced to death? There tends to be discrimination.
There was one in Texas, wasn't there? Oh, that was after.
Huh? But maybe.
Bush sentenced a woman to death in Texas.
What?
Under Bush, they executed a woman in Texas.
Maybe it was the one, yeah.
Not in your Vegas.
No, maybe I think
But it must have been they appealed. It was like 98 or 99, yeah. And he was governor.
No, but there was I ran into a couple of, more than a couple actually, of legal paper about why women don't get sentenced to death. Anyway, going back to our discussion. No, we have not done it. Excellent idea. All I can say is that the cases in which the guy was found innocent are a fairly small minority. So I would be shocked if a similar result would not hold if we throw away those
There's a
cases.
number 7% from your sample. In one of the first slides, you said that it's 7%, so there will be no enough observation.
In the first bit.
Yeah, there was, I think it was 7 or 8%, yeah. So I don't, it would not change. I mean, if we drop the 7%, I don't think it would change anything. But in principle, it's an excellent idea because unless you think that the racial bias is so strong that they purposely, sentence to death an innocent person. But yeah.
Well, I have a question regarding this. Empirical work trying to look if there is a bias in the Supreme Court judges. But maybe you can just ask them. I mean, maybe you can just interview these guys and ask them if they think that there is racial bias in the interior process.
Well, that would be a rather different research strategy, which certainly would not be my comparative advantage. I would imagine that they would tend to answer no, because the same way as if you answer the professor of economics whether they think that there is a bias in favor of thinking that the market always works or something. So with that part of our gene, so we would say no, we have no bias. The same way a judge would say no, there's absolutely no bias because we judges are just perfect. So there might be a way of getting some information out of them based on what they do. In fact, the paper I mentioned, well, forget that. The paper I mentioned earlier that tries to measure the ideology of judges. Those guys, they look at decisions taken by judges, not on criminal cases, but on cases where there is some sort of a left and right political spectrum. For example, pro or against affirmative action, or pro against business in case of a lawsuit for environmental issues. So there are ways of measuring ideology, and that's actually what that paper does, in addition to party affiliation. But I think to ask them straight out, do you think there is racial bias in the court system in the U.S.? they may say yes around a dinner party with their close friend, but in front of somebody interviewing them officially, I doubt they would get much out of it. But you could ask, and that, again, that would not be my comparative advantage, but I'm sure there are ways of asking questions that you can, from which you can read some attitude. There are some psychological tests that one could do, but
There's this recent study of NBA referees that looks at the percentage of fouls called when it's white referees on white players and black referees on black players like that, and you get like instantaneous, and you get this very tiny but very significant effect of race on calls, and that's sort of a measure of this sort of racial bias. And
I am
test.
perfectly convinced that race, well, I mean, that's probably the most obvious statement you ever hear, but it's pretty obvious that race is extremely important in the U.S. as a political phenomenon. So to find biases everywhere, from basketball courts to the death penalty, it doesn't surprise me. Doesn't surprise me at all. I should also say that this is I think one should think about this as a very specific test of a very specific bias, of mistake made by first courts. There could be all sorts of other bias that we don't measure here. For example, more cases of black defendants end up in the capital sentencing, trajectory, namely fewer cases are bargained out of the capital sentencing or prosecuted differently. So all the things that have to do with police procedure and who actually get to the first sentence is out from the model. There could be all sort of bias there that we don't measure. So we have a very specific test of a very specific bias between first court and superior court. It's a very specific, I think it's fairly precise based on the assumption of the model, but it's very specific on one particular type of bias. It does not capture bias that could be somewhere else in the system. Yeah?
As I understand it, the higher courts can only judge the fairness of the first trial. So it makes your test kind of, in some ways you can interpret it stronger, because these appeals are not saying that they're not catching all the people who are incorrectly convicted. They're catching all the people who are unfairly convicted. That's what you're, so unfairness is more related to racial discrimination anyway. But they won't overturn, so it could be that I was incorrectly convicted of murder because the jury misunderstood the evidence, but if the trial was fair, they still will convict me, and you don't pick that up. So you're only picking up the ones that were unfairly done. So it's even harder to get at this, reversal business, because that's the only way they do it.
Probably not related question. You know that now in Russian mass media there are discussions about is it reasonable, is it ethical to indicate the nationality of a killer, not just race, nationality, or some that he or she is gay or like that. And why? Arguments are that it increases tension in the society, or it creates special pressure on judges and so on. What's your opinion? Is it necessary to, in mass media, to indicate nationality and?
I think it's a very important question. I think that from a, I am not an expert, but I would find it probably very, very difficult to write a constitutional law that says that a newspaper cannot say the nationality of anybody. But I think that just to give another example, I think that there is in Italy, where there's been a lot of immigration, partly legal, partly illegal, from North Africa and Eastern Europe, there is a widespread sense that the increase in crime occurring in Italy is because of immigration. A lot of this thing is actually wrong. I mean, apparently there's a very nice paper that shows that the increase in crime has occurred to the fact that a few years ago they, I don't remember why, but they let everybody free from jail for some reason. I don't know. I don't remember why. There was some reason, I forget what it was, but they let everybody go free, including mafia, killers, and anybody. And believe it or not, crime went up. And so, so that's a perfect. But going back to your question, there have been a couple of recent cases of pretty horrible crimes that happened to be committed by immigrants, and then the press made this huge thing. So I fully agree that what you just said happens, and I fully agree that it's important. I think that how to prevent it is probably has to be something that goes much deeper than restricting the freedom of the press, and I think the press, unfortunately, often is the result of how people feel rather than so it would take us along. But yes, I do agree that immigration and crime in Western Europe, the issue of immigration and crime has been addressed in ways which are often racially motivated or ethnically and racially biased. Yes.
Can I ask a question? So you said that their test is very specific to this problem, but still quite an impressive test procedure. So can you think of any other situation, not from their courts system, but from whatever, I don't know, from basketball or whatever else, where you can implement such a procedure to think of some biases and so on?
Well, I think that yes. I mean, the same type of test have been applied to racial profiling in stopping cars for drugs. That's another application. The model there is very different because there is no issue of evidence, there is no issue of type 1 or type 2 error. You either find the drug or you don't. So the theoretical model is much simpler. But the statistical test is essentially the same. It boils down to the fact that the probability of catching a minority with drugs has to be the same as the probability of catching a white, so the error rate has to be the same. And therefore, in that model, it is not a racial bias if you stop cars driven by more cars driven by black men and white. But because that is simply because black commit more crime, so it's not a racial bias finding that, but it would be a racial bias if you keep making mistakes because you stop so many blacks and you never find anything. And so you need to have the same type of mistakes there. So that would be another application. I think that you could think of an application to labor market discrimination kind of thing. So as long if you have applicants and not make me think on the top of my head too much, but I think in any case where there is discrimination, you could certainly come up with application along those lines. I think these are particularly useful, this type of thing, when there is statistical discrimination or bias. I mean, here we allowed perfectly the court to statistically discriminate, namely to put different thresholds for white and black because the black commit more crimes. But we tested that they were doing it in a way which allows for the statistical discrimination, but that captures racial discrimination. So in any application where there is statistical discrimination makes sense, but beyond that is racial bias, it's the same type of tests that are perfectly applicable.
So I think it's an extremely interesting question. There's a lot of questions around here, but we're extremely out of time. So I want to thank Alberto
Thank you.
for having lecture.